Right. Good morning, everyone. Happy Tuesday. Happy first day of the state fair. We were just talking about that. Today's the first day of the state fair. Very exciting stuff. Hope everyone is doing well today. Thank you for joining us on a Tuesday morning to talk a bit about improving writing for English 1 through 4. My name is Casey Prince Harvey. I will be guiding us through today's work, and we're going to go ahead and just jump right in. There we go. So a little bit of housekeeping to get us started. Again, my name is Casey Prince Harvey. I am Education Associate for Humanities here at the South Carolina Department of Education in the Office of Assessment and Standards. I work on our standards side, and I do a lot of things, but one of the main things that I do is provide support for our high school English teachers. That is my background. I was a high school English teacher, so this is my group. I'm very happy to be here with you today. And I am joined by two of my teammates. I have Mandy Hawker, who is our elementary ELA education associate, also on the standard side. And then Brenda McCormick, who is our middle level ELA education associate, also on the standard side. So we are your ELA team, and we are here to support the work that you do, either in the classroom or supporting your teachers if you're in a coaching or specialist position. So anything that we can do to support your work in regard to the standards, we are here for, and happy to help. So those are just some quick introductions on our end, but I would love to hear about who we have in our virtual space. So if you don't mind dropping in the chat your name, where you are serving in our state, and how semester one or fall semester is going for you so far. I would love to see who we have here today. Oh, I see Lexrich 5, so not too far from us. Hardyville. Okay. English 3 and 4. Fantastic. Berkeley. Berkeley is gorgeous. Spartanburg 7. Allendale. Okay. So I'm seeing a pretty good swath of our state. Also see Hardyville English 1 and 2. Those are my personally, those were my favorite. To teach English 2 was my like baby. I love English 2. Love teaching English 2. I see Lexington. Okay, so ALA in Lexington. Fantastic. English 1 and 3. So we've got all grade levels for high school. We've got a lot of our regions throughout the state. Very nice, very good to see that even though we're kind of a small group today, maybe more will come on, that we've got representation from all over. So that is fantastic. And feel free if you haven't dropped in your introduction in the chat yet, we'll have that open kind of throughout. A little bit of additional housekeeping. Our landing page, Brenna is going to drop this in the chat for you. So for each of our webinars, if you've not attended in the past, we do have a landing page that will have all of the materials that we will discuss today, and some extra resources. So anything that is relevant that maybe we're not going to directly discuss today, but might be something for you to go back and look at later, we have on there as well. And then breakout rooms. So again, with this being a small group, we will utilize the chat throughout for different engagements, and you're welcome to unmute if you have a question or want to share something. That is completely fine. But we will have a couple of breakout opportunities throughout the session today, and that will be some time for you to join in with your small group where you can accomplish specific tasks. We'll have a few engagements that you'll take part in during that time. You'll have some opportunities to reflect on your learning in those small groups, and then, of course, share ideas and resources. One of the best things about our webinars is that you get to talk to people from throughout the state. So there's so much expertise and experience in this room, and people that you may not normally have conversations with. So it's a great opportunity to share ideas, share resources, and just learn from each other. So when we have those breakout sessions, we do ask that to the best of your ability, that you are able to focus and participate during that time. Of course, we know everyone's wearing lots of hats and doing lots of things, but when we do that time, that's kind of your time where you can collaborate with one another. The last piece of housekeeping is just the reminder of your high quality instructional materials. Those would be your ELA textbooks that were a part of your adoption for this school year. So your high quality instructional materials and resources are kind of your initial go-to for your instruction because your curriculum is decided at the local level. Throughout this session, we will also share some resources and some supports. But just as a reminder, those are one of many examples or some of many examples. And just to make sure that as you are looking for those additional resources and support, that you are guiding teachers or as a teacher yourself, taking a look at those materials that you have available to you. So those of you who are attending live, we are happy to share that we are offering recertification credit for each hour of webinar participation. So we are in a 2-hour session, so you will receive your 2 hours of recertification credit. There are 3 criteria or 3 requirements in order to receive that recertification credit. So the first is the live participation in the webinar, so attending the webinar live and being an active participant. The next is remaining in attendance for the duration. I know that can be a little bit difficult with 2 hours sort of in the middle of your morning, but that is one of those requirements. And then lastly, completing the feedback form at the end of the webinar. So that will just be how we know that you were here for the entirety. And that is where we will also collect your email address so that within about a week, we will be able to share those recertification credits to you, and also our resources, our recording, and any additional resources. All right, so with that being said, we're going to launch into today's purpose, and I've broken it down into really 2 areas. The first being to enhance participants' understanding of the expectations for our 2024 South Carolina College and Career Ready ELA standards. The next is going to focus us in a little bit more, and that is to provide instructional strategies and support to support students' ability to improve writing through effective planning, feedback, revision, and editing. So today we are focusing on improving writing and those areas of planning, feedback, revision, and editing. So with that being said, if this is our purpose for today, then what is your why? What drew you into today's topic? Why would you want to come and spend 2 hours on a Tuesday morning hanging out with the ELA team to talk about improving writing? What is your why? If you don't mind dropping that in the chat for me, I would love to see kind of where you're at and what you're hoping to gain from today. All right, learn more about the standards, potential best practices for teaching them. We will definitely do a dive into the intent of our indicators today. English 2 writing EOC. So there will be a support on your landing page for that called the Assessment Quick Links for Teachers. So while today we're going to talk more generally about our ELA standards for all grade levels for high school and writing in general for high school. I know that there are going to be questions about EOC and what that looks like for summative assessment. So there is a resource there that is going to be a support that I highly recommend you look at if you are an English 2 teacher. Let's see. Oh, thank you, Renee. We're so happy to be a support for you, and to do whatever we can to try and make sure that you feel confident and comfortable in our standards, and that you feel supported in how you instruct those standards. Yes, Mandy, absolutely. Improving writing feels like a new term for our 2024 standards. That's because it is. Yes, and we will absolutely talk about that today. Want to learn how to help students improve their writing, learn how to use their voices effectively, improve scholarly writing for classwork, college classes, practices to support secondary teachers. We will share some resources today that will be helpful. Let's see. Just making sure you have a firm grasp of those standards. Let's see. Wanting to know how to support English 1 through 4 teachers. Wonderful. All right. So, I love that. I see that we're all wanting to gain a firm understanding of our standards, figure out how to provide instruction for those. And then I do see some questions regarding assessment. I will be sure to not only on your landing page, that assessment quick links for teachers, have that there as a support for you, but we will also add the contact information for our development partners. So we're on the standard side, we work specifically with the standards, but we will make sure you have the contact information for our partners if there is anything outside of the quick links that you have additional questions about. All right. So let's consider this, right? English teachers, we have to start with a quote. And I've split this quote in two, so I want us to do a little bit of reflection on this, because as I was building out today's session, I always look for something as a little bit of inspiration, and this was the one that really drew my attention. So the first part of the quote is, "The number one epiphany that I have had regarding writing instruction is that a piece of writing can never fully be viewed as complete. Every draft, including a final draft, is a work in progress. I can speak to this in my own writing. Whenever I go back to look at something I thought was complete and finished, I always find a way to make a sentence better, a paragraph stronger, and a piece of evidence clearer." There's the second part. "The number one issue that I have personally witnessed with writing instruction has been this perception that a final draft is final and that a student should be able to turn in something that is 100% perfect. When it comes to writing, there is no such thing as 100% perfect." So think about that quote, reflect on it a little bit. Tell me in the chat what your initial thoughts are. Do you connect to this? Do you agree with it? Do you disagree with it? Is there anything here that you can connect to from personal experience? I see preach. 99% of writing is rewriting. Oh, that is fantastic. I need to like give snaps to that. Absolutely. All right. I see agreement. Please give the opportunities to revise and rewrite and change. Perfect doesn't exist. Growth and improvement should be the goal. Always find yourself after time to reflect, clarifying and improving. Always room for improvement. Students struggle with wanting to know that what they need. Oh yeah, absolutely. There's so much of a focus of what do I need to do to get a 100? What kind of writing are you talking about? Yes, that's a fantastic question. And this is writing in general. This is just writing instruction. Right. Um, absolutely, absolutely. And I don't know if this is something that you've experienced either in the classroom or maybe supporting teachers, is that sometimes students feel that first draft is the final draft, right? Why do I need to change? I've already done it once. Why do I need to do it again? Or even from a teacher standpoint, we spent so much time working on this. How are we going to have time to go back? What is that going to look like? And one thing that we want to emphasize with our 2024 standards is that improving writing is something that is new in that it is its own standalone standard. And we want to consider the implications of that, right? The emphasis on going back and looking for ways to improve our writing in lots of different aspects. So just keep that in mind as we move forward. Okay. We're going to do a little bit of a pulse check, maybe a little bit of a pre-assessment to see where everyone is at as we move into today's work. So I'm going to have three kind of areas with a description, and I want you to think about where you fall on the scale from maybe a red, which is what we might think of as like a level 1, not quite there yet. This is an area of growth for me, all the way to a green, which is like, I do this, I know this, I feel comfortable in this. And our goal is that no matter where you fall on the scale with each of these statements, is for you to move a little bit forward on the scale by the end of our time today. So think about your personal kind of areas where you fall here and how we might improve in those areas. So you're welcome to put this in the chat if you want. If you just want to think about it personally, that's fine too. It's more so just an initial pulse check. So our first area being standards and expectations for improving writing. So as we mentioned, improving writing is an important factor in our 2024 standards. So just to see where you fall on the scale right now, whether you're at a green, into a yellow, into a red maybe, with the statement, I thoroughly understand the expectations for both grammar and conventions, which is C4, and improving writing, which is C5 for my grade levels. So again, you don't have to put this in the chat if you don't want to. Maybe just think to yourself if you're more comfortable with that. But do you feel like you understand the expectations for grammar and conventions and for improving writing, which are two specific standards within the 2024 standards document as your initial pulse check? Our next statement for instructional strategies. Okay, Mandy, I see you're yellow-green. Yellow-green. Maybe there are some things that you feel like you've got a good grasp on, some areas where you might have a little bit of question. Absolutely. Instructional strategies. I have a variety of instructional strategies to pull from when asking students to demonstrate and or practice their learning around revision, editing, and grammar. So do you feel like you have a lot of tools in your toolkit when it comes to providing instruction in these areas? Okay, maybe you feel more red. Absolutely. This was always the area that I felt that I struggled with the most as a teacher, particularly with editing, because as a high school English teacher, I wanted more interactive ways for students to edit, like things that weren't just an editing checklist, right? I wanted them to have more practical application. I wanted them to have more engagement, to do things that were kind of outside of just that checklist. Do you have a period at the end of your sentence? Did you capitalize all of your letters? So that would have been probably my biggest area for growth. And then lastly, writing experiences. One thing that we will talk about today is when we look at C4 and C5, when we look at grammar and conventions, and when we look at improving writing through revision and editing and grammar, is that we're doing this in the context of student writing, right? Students are applying these skills and they apply those through writing experiences. So let's think about this one. I can identify opportunities where I've provided writing experiences of varying lengths and depths to support student learning. I can adapt writing experiences to intentionally incorporate skills for improving writing. So do students have lots of opportunities to write in lots of different ways for lots of different tasks, purposes, or audiences where we can build in those strategies for improving? That's huge. Okay, I see a yellow for sure. And wherever you are, again, the goal is just to kind of move you a step forward. Even if you're a green, maybe you can take some of this back and share with your colleagues. All right, so we will go over each of these today. You will have opportunities to interact with each of these and hopefully be able to move up that scale a little bit more. All right, so our agenda for today, we will start off with an overview of improving writing. We are going to look at the end goal for C4 and C5, which are our standards that address grammar and conventions and improving writing. We will then do a dive into the specific grade level expectations for each of those. So we all know where we fit into the puzzle, English 1 through 4. So what those expectations are for students at each grade level. We will then talk about some instructional practices, give you some opportunities to collaborate and share ideas, and then do a little bit of clarity and closure. So starting out with our overview of improving writing. So as a reminder, our 2024 South Carolina College and Career Ready ELA standards have 4 strands. We have foundations of literacy, applications of reading, research, and then written and oral communication. So today we are focusing in on that 4th strand, which is written and oral communications. And within that strand, we have actually 9 standards and 9 indicators, but there are 5 specifically that deal with writing for K through 12th grade. Okay, so we have our first 3, which address our 3 modes of writing within the standards. So we have argumentative writing, informative expository writing, and narrative writing. And then our last 2, which are C4, Communication 4, and Communication 5, address grammar and conventions and improving writing. So for today, we're going to focus in on those last 2. Now, some of you may have joined us over the summer. We hosted a summer webinar series on all 5 of these standards for high school. So we have a webinar recording for all 3 modes, and we have webinar recordings individually for grammar and conventions and improving writing. So those resources are on your landing page. If you want to go back and you feel like you need a deeper dive just into argumentative writing or a deeper dive into narrative writing and how we use narrative and other modes of writing, those are there for you. But just for today's purposes, we're going to zoom in on those 2 that are at the end, C4 and C5. And we're actually going to flip them. So I know typically you would think C4 means that it comes first, C5 comes after, but we're going to start with C5. We're going to start with that standard that we call improving writing. Okay, so what we see here on this slide is the overall standard for Communication 5. So this is the end of learning expectation for students. So this is by the time they finish their K through English 4 academic experience, this is the end goal. Okay. So I want you to take a quick look at it. It says revise writing to improve clarity and enhance style appropriate to audiences, purpose, and task. And I want us to pause here to think about that word revise, right? What is revision? What does it mean to revise? And we actually have a definition from our glossary. So I want to put that on here for us to take a look at. So what does it mean? What is revision? So in our standards, in our glossary, revision is the part of writing and preparing written material concerned primarily with reconsidering and reworking information in the text related to its task, purpose, and audience. And I want us to pause here and drop in the chat any words or phrases from this definition that draw your attention. What do you see and what do you not see? So drop in the chat anything from that definition that draws your attention. Okay, so I see reconsidering and reworking, primarily with reconsidering and reworking. One thing we don't see, yes, I've seen a couple of you mention not editing and not proofreading, right? We're talking about the big structural changes to the writing, right? And, oh, related to the task. Yes, there's an intentionality here. If we ask students to reconsider or rework the information in that text, we're doing it in order to focus on the task, the purpose, and the audience, which means students need to be intentional about the choices that they make. So yes, absolutely. Big sort of overarching changes to the text. And the intentionality focusing on the task, the purpose, and the audience. The one thing that we don't necessarily see here when we talk about revision is editing, right? And that's because editing is something different um, in our standards. It is a part of improving writing, but it is not revision, right? They are two processes that work together to help students improve their writing overall. Now we're going to flip over to C4. That's our grammar and conventions standard. And again, this is the end goal. It says demonstrate command of standard English grammar and conventions when writing. And again, pausing here to talk about what are conventions? What does it mean, right? How does that relate to our standards? So again, pulling the definition from our glossary. What are conventions? They're the rules of composition used to make writing more clear and comprehensible. Some examples include mechanics, such as spelling, punctuation, and capitalization, as well as grammatical and language features such as word order, subject-verb agreement, and verb tense. So let's do the same thing here. What words or phrases draw your attention? What do you see here? What sort of connections can you make to what we just talked about with revision and improving writing? All right, focus on clarity. Oh, Renee, yes, make writing more clear and comprehensible, not perfect. Right, we're using these rules specifically to make the writing more clear and comprehensible. And there are examples, right? There are examples of what might be included in that. I'm seeing from Michelle intentional choices within sentence structure, also mindful of conventions for clarity. Absolutely. So we're seeing kind of this being more specific to what we might think of as that proofreading, right? Or that editing piece. So let's look at those kind of side by side. We just talked about that definition for revision from our glossary. What we haven't looked at yet is the definition of editing from our glossary. And that is the correction of mechanical features in writing, such as spelling, punctuation, and capitalization in order to prepare materials for publication or presentation. So in looking at both of these, looking at revision, looking at editing, which one do you think best describes that C4 that we just looked at? Which one best describes C5, which was the first one that we talked about? Yeah, C4 really is addressing that editing, right? C5 is addressing more so. We talk about that revision. We'll see editing start to come into play in the grade level expectations as a process for improving writing. But what I want us to think about today, that broader question, is how can those grammar and conventions, which are C4, support or clarify the expectations for improving writing? So if improving writing is a sort of the umbrella, there's revision in there, there's editing. We'll talk about planning and feedback a little bit later. C4 is going to give us the specific grade level expectations when we ask students to edit, when we ask them to proofread. We want to align that to whatever the grammar expectation is for that grade, right? We don't want to hold them to a standard for grammar that they may not have learned yet, right? Or not focus on skills that they should be learning at that grade level and get stuck on things that maybe they learned in prior years. So think about how grammar and conventions, that C4, can support and clarify our expectations for improving writing, that both are a piece of that puzzle, right? And we'll think about that and consider that as we move through today's work. All right, so we just explored kind of the overarching standard for C4 and C5. We know what the end goal is when students leave our K-12 setting. And we just looked at the definitions for revision and editing and conventions in a broad context. What I want us to do now is just take a moment to consider the practical application of all of those ideas. And we're going to do that through the grade level entrance statements. So our grade level entrance statements are in our standards document. Every grade level starts with a page that gives an overview of learning at that grade level. So it will include examples of reading, research, and writing that students might engage in at that grade level. It also gives some examples of types of texts or types of writing engagement students may take part in to demonstrate their mastery. So these are meant to provide a starting point for instruction, gives us an idea of what we might do in our classrooms. So teachers can use this to build out long-range plans. They can add them to their course syllabi. They can share with parents just to say, here's what 8th grade ELA looks like. So we're going to take a look at some of these. Brenna just put in the chat the grade level entrance statements for English 1 through 4. And I'm going to ask that we take about 4 minutes for you to pick one of those grade levels to read over. Okay, doesn't matter. You can pick the grade level you serve. I know some of you serve multiple grade levels. In that case, pick your favorite. There's no right or wrong here. And as you do that, we are going to prepare for a little bit of a virtual turn and talk. So what we'll do is I'm going to give you a prompt here. As you read your grade level entrance statement, I want you to prepare to respond to that prompt. Then, once we get prompts in the chat, I'll ask that you react or reply to one other post. So it's a little bit of a virtual turn and talk, okay? So our prompt is, as you look at that grade level entrance statement and focus specifically in on what writing looks like at that grade level, what might revision and editing look like in the grade levels that you serve? So you'll get some examples of how students might be writing at that grade level. Think about how they might revise or edit that writing based on your knowledge of that grade level. Okay, so it is 10:33. Prepare to have your response in the chat by about 10:37. And then we'll go back and do some response, okay? Okay, go ahead and get started. Right, it is 10:36, so this is around about the time where you want to start dropping your ideas in the chat with what revision and editing might look like in the grade or grades that you serve based on what you saw in that grade level entrance statement. Okay, I'm seeing refining writing for an intended audience with English 2, English 1, checklists and peer editing. English 1, refine links of the modes, focus on tone and style. See another English 1, focus on tone and style. The appropriate audience. Revision might look like word choice, using a variety of sentence structures, looking for structures specific to types of writing, seeing reasoning, rhetoric, selecting the best evidence to support claims. So in that case, I'm thinking argumentative writing, most likely. Let's see. Revision in the 3 modes. Let's see. Sensory details, evidence, rhetoric, importance of professionalism. Ooh, that's a great point. Yeah, the importance of professionalism in your college career readiness types of writing. Correct grammar and editing are important. Incorporating narrative into those other modes of writing, refine to introduce a claim and support. Yes. So, Patty, that incorporating narrative into other modes of writing, which does begin in English 2, is such a nuance in writing, right? That is such a skill to be able to take those modes and blend them together really intentionally. So to use those narratives to build buy-in or hook your audience, for example, to make that writing relevant. And that definitely uh, includes those areas for refinement and that need for revision, to be really intentional about how you use those narratives and how it's going to impact your audience. Critical thinking is imperative for 10th grade to demonstrate the understanding of the different structures. Yes, when we might use one mode versus another. Let's see, English 2, analyzing how an author creates sarcasm and verbal irony in a text can be challenging for students to identify that sarcasm part. Yeah, that is one that again is quite nuanced. Absolutely. All right, if you have not, take a moment to react or reply to one other post in the chat. So see what other people have added in. You can either react if you hover over their text, you should have an option to like give a thumbs up or a smiley face or an emoji of some sort, or you can hit that arrow that is pointing to the left and create a reply. So give you just a minute to take a look at someone else's post as part of our virtual turn and talk. All right, we'll take about 30 more seconds. And Kim, we have, I hosted a webinar over the summer on your landing page. I have it linked, and that narrative webinar talks about narrative and other modes of writing. So it is linked on there, and the resources are linked on there for you. So, and if you have other questions, I'm happy to follow up with you. So on your landing page, Brenna's dropped that in the chat a couple of times. That is where all of our links are housed. And so I've got all the links for today. And then there's like a blue bar that says, I think, additional resources or something along those lines. And underneath that, I put all of the webinars from this summer. I put the resources from the summer. I put the assessment quick links for teachers. If you have questions regarding English 2 EOC, that's where they have the TDW rubrics, the specifications, all of those things. So there are a lot of different resources on there that you can explore. Yes, yes. So try to put everything in one place for you. And if there's something there that you're still looking for that you can't find, just let me know and I can add it to the page. All right. So we'll go ahead and wrap up this section. We've just kind of done the overview of improving writing, right? We looked at the end goal for C4. We looked at the end goal for C5. We talked a little bit about what that might look like within those grade levels. And now we're going to do the deep dive into the actual grade level indicators and the grade level expectation for both of those. And we're going to do that through what we call our vertical progression. You have both of these vertical progression, C4 and C5, on your landing page, and we will drop them in the chat as well. So for those of you who have not seen this, this is Appendix B in the standards document. Personally, it is my favorite iteration of the standards because what it does is it takes each standard and shows you K through English 4 how it progresses. So we see where that skill starts in kindergarten and then how it moves over time to get to that end goal of the standard with English 4. Oh, and I'm so glad that you like this resource and the glossary. That makes me so happy. When you look at this version of those standards where you see the K through English 4, you will notice that in some grade levels that there are words or phrases that are in bold. And that is because the bold indicates where there are new skills or content introduced. So that is a very good indicator for me as a teacher. If I am teaching English 2 and I'm looking here at C 5.1, I see a few words that are in bold. I see style, I see audience, purpose, and task. So that's going to indicate to me that with this standard, and they might have learned it in some other grade levels in other places, but for this standard specifically, those are the words that are going to be new. Those are the skills or content that will be new. So that tells me that I probably need to focus in on that a little bit, right? I need to go look and see if there's a definition in the glossary. Are there supports available for this on our resources page? Or what's in my instructional materials that's going to help support this? That's just a good indicator for me. So what I've done here is I have pulled just 8th grade through English 4 for C5. And we have the full progression on your landing page. And Brenna, if you don't mind dropping it in the chat as well, if you want to see the whole thing, K through English 4. But I've just kind of zoomed in on 8th grade through English 4. I know some people, they have English 1 in 8th grade at their school. So I wanted to make sure we had that on here. But let's just take a quick look and think about anything from these grade levels that draws your attention. Are there any words, skills, or content that stand out to you? Are there any patterns that you notice? So take a look. You can either look at the version I have on the screen, or if you want to click on the version that Brenna dropped in the chat, just look at our high school expectations. What patterns or noticings are drawing your attention? And again, this is C5. This is our improving writing standard, the more general improving writing standard. All right. Style, audience, purpose, and task, not introduced in this standard until English 2. Before that, they're focusing on clarity, cohesiveness. They improve writing by planning, editing, and considering feedback from adults and peers. Yes. We improve in order to enhance. Yes, clarity, recurring. Yes, Michelle, after English 2, we're not seeing necessarily new skills introduced. We're seeing more so a continuation of that practice, consistently being asked to improve their writing. Yes, they start this in kindergarten, right? Students are improving their writing beginning all the way back in kindergarten. We do get a little bit fancy in English 2. Yes, yes. Yes, and that emphasis on improving the writing with suggestions from others, from both peers and adults. Absolutely. So, one thing that I wanted to point out here, considering instead of incorporating feedback from adults, right? We consider the feedback. It doesn't mean that we have to use every piece of feedback that we get, right? If we did, we could end up with who knows what. Thank you for letting me know. So the one thing that I wanted to focus in on here, the one that really stood out to me the most was that emphasis on task, purpose, and audience. We see it in English 2 and then 3 and then 4. And even though we see it in English 2 for the first time with this particular standard, this is not the only place where we see task, purpose, and audience across our writing standards. So I wanted just to kind of point out a couple of areas where we see this reiterated. So we see it in argumentative writing, that's communication 1. We see it in narrative writing with English 3. We see it in English 1 with informative or expository writing. We also see it in 7th grade with informative writing. And what I want to point out here is within those standards specifically for the modes of writing, what we have are these little sub-indicators that say that students need to establish and maintain a style or have an organization or use a tone that are appropriate for the task, the purpose, and the audience. And it's not just high school, right? We see it here in 7th grade. With narrative, we see it all the way back in 6th grade. So students are being asked across all 3 modes of writing to be intentional about the choices that they make, right? When it comes to the tone that they use, the style, when it comes to how they organize their writing, that they're considering the task, the purpose, and the audience. So when they improve their writing as its own standard, they are taking those same things into consideration. We can also see this compared to 2015. So I'm showing you here now our 2015 standards that address what we would call revision or editing, and then our 2024 right next to them. And the one thing here that draws my attention the most is in 2015, there is no standalone standard that addresses improving writing. So whereas we have C5, it's its own standard, its own expectation, the improving writing was embedded as like a sub indicator. So you just saw how we had like A, B, C, D, E, F, blah, 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 for narrative, for argumentative, for informative. It was one of those very last sub indicators within the 3 modes. It wasn't a standard that stood alone. Now in 2024, it is a standard that stands alone. The other thing is there's a piece of language in 2015 that is missing compared to 2024. And that is what some of you noticed, feedback. Feedback was not included within that sub-indicator in 2015. And not just feedback from adults, but feedback from peers. So I want us to think about some of these shifts. The fact that improving writing is now its own standard, and the fact that feedback is now included within that process for improving writing. What do you think are the implications or the impacts of those shifts? What does that mean for teachers in the classroom? What is the message there? So feel free to drop in the chat, or if you want to unmute, what do you think are the implications or impacts of those 2 shifts? teachers have a clearer focus when teaching writing. Oh, yes, the emphasis on collaboration and discourse. Absolutely. And think too about in order for students to consider feedback from adults and peers, there needs to be a culture of feedback, right? Students need to feel comfortable giving and receiving feedback in a variety of ways. Yes, feedback is important. We know what we're trying to say in our writing. Don't know. Yeah, absolutely. Incorporating feedback, the growth mindset. Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And the importance of creating that culture of feedback, because if you only give feedback once, more than likely it's going to be taken as criticism, right? There need to be multiple opportunities where students are giving or receiving feedback, or receiving feedback from adults. And it says adults, it doesn't say just the teacher, right? So could that be someone outside of the classroom? Yes, absolutely. All right. So that was just our overview of improving writing, so C5, and looking really at those grade level expectations. I want us to flip back again to C4, which is grammar and conventions. Now, this one, it looks a little bit different. So whereas the C5 standard, that vertical progression was much more focused and there weren't a whole lot of changes from grade level to grade level, C4 is very specific. So the progression focuses more on the grammar and conventions expectations for each grade level. So there are specific expectations for the grammar skills that students learn in each grade. So that means that that vertical progression looks really long compared to C5 because it does have all of those sub-indicators. So what I want us to do, because this one is much lengthier, there are much more defined specific skills at each grade level. I want us to take an opportunity to deconstruct this indicator specifically. So we know exactly what piece of the puzzle each grade level kind of has. So I'm going to model this first with 8th grade. And then in just a few minutes, I'm going to pop you into breakout rooms where each group is going to have one of the grade levels, English 1 through 4, to do this same process. Okay, so we can really break down the skills, the content, and then what we might do with that learning. So on my left-hand side, or actually let's start at the top. So at the top, I have the indicator. This is C 4.1 for 8th grade. So all of the grade levels are going to start with the same statement. So use rules and make intentional decisions about standard English grammar and conventions, to write compositions in varied sentence structures and when writing. And then it's got your A, B, C, D, so on and so forth with all those specific skills for my grade level. So this is 8th grade, A through G. Those are the skills that students are expected to learn by the end of that year. So I've broken it down into skills and content. And what I've done on the skill side, which is that left-hand column, I have pulled those verbs from each of those sub-indicators, right? So I've got apply for A, use for B, so on and so forth. Then on the right-hand side, that right column, I've pulled out the content that goes along with each one. So I'm just breaking it down into the skills and the content. And what I want to do with this, now that I'm seeing, is I want to look for patterns. I want to look for ahas. I want to look for things that maybe I need to go back and think about, that maybe I need to brush up on, that might be new or might be different, and maybe make some next steps for myself. So I'm calling that insights and considerations. So my insights are my ahas or my patterns. My considerations are my what do I do with this? So starting out with my insights, the one thing that I noticed right off the bat is when I look at the skills, all of them focus on practical application, right? All of those skills are apply, use, revise. Even when we have some lower complexity skills like identify or distinguish between, it is partnered with a practical application, right? So that's really important to me. And it makes sense because when I look back at the standard or the indicator language, it says when writing. So students are doing this in their writing. The other piece, my consideration where I might need to make a next step might be in the content. So for me, I'm looking at grammatical mood, indicative, subjunctive, conditional, and imperative. Maybe that is something that I have not previously focused on in 8th grade, right? So I need to go back and maybe make a plan for myself. Maybe I need to look at my instructional materials. Maybe my district or school has other resources that we use for grammar that I can apply here. Maybe I have a colleague down the hall who is, very grammar savvy, and maybe I need to go and partner, right, to build up some content knowledge so I can be prepared to provide that instruction for my students, right? So I've done my breakdown, I've looked at my insights, and I've thought about my next steps or my considerations. So that is what we are going to replicate in our breakout rooms. So in just a moment, you will pop out to some breakout rooms. We'll have one for English 1, 2, 3, and 4. And you're going to get you're going to get the slides, a copy of the slides, and it's actually on your landing page as well. And each one will have a grade level indicator in that top box. And I'll ask that in your small group, you fill out, discuss, and then fill out what you can for the bottom portions. So what are your skills that you're noticing? So those verbs from the sub indicators. What content goes along with those? And then what can you pull out in terms of insights and considerations? What are your patterns, your new learning, your wonderings? What are your next steps and how you could apply that in your practice? So it's okay if you don't get to every sub indicator. I would say that the goal would be to have at least a little bit of something in the insights and considerations and a little bit of something in the skills and the content. Okay. When you break out to your group, your slides will have in that top right box, it'll say English 1, Group 1, or English 2. And so that will tell you which grade level that you are working with. And then in your group, in the top left corner of your breakout room, you will see that the group, like the name of your group, matches that slide. Does that make sense? So you should, whatever the name of your group is, the slide will say the same thing. Okay, so we are going to take, I'll say about 10 minutes for you to work in your small group, in your breakout, with just your grade level indicator to do that deconstruction. And then when we pop back out, I will ask that you just share any insights or considerations, maybe just one thing from your discussion. Okay, are there any questions before we pop out? Okay, Mandy, are you ready to pop everyone out to the breakout rooms?
Yes, they are open and they are on their way.
Okay, perfect. I think that is just about everyone. Yeah, that looks to be just about everyone. Hopefully that 10 minutes or so was enough time for you to talk in your group, to look over that specific grade level indicator, break down your skills and content, and then think about insights and considerations. I've seen some great things on the slides so far, but I wanted to take a moment to see if each group doesn't mind sharing some of their takeaways. And we can either do that if you want to unmute and like one person from your group unmute and share some of your takeaways, or if you prefer to do that in the chat. I think as long as we just kind of get a feel for what each group got out of that time together. So I'll give y'all a second. If you want to drop something in the chat, that's great. If someone wants to unmute and share, that's fine too.
As we had English 4, and what we noticed, it's like apply and use. So basically the kids should already have mastered the skills, and they're just using it to apply. So really there's no new learning. It's just applying what they've learned in the past.
Absolutely. And if you look at the slides like English 1 to 4, you see that the number of sub-indicators gets smaller and smaller and smaller too, to the point where English 4, there's really just 2 that are like applying or using, and then the one that's about the multimedia tools or resources for publication. So yes, it's very much at that point we're just reiterating the or revisiting skills that they've previously learned and applying them. Yes. I see, Sophia, you talked about English 1, the importance of revisiting. Capitalization, yes, at that point, they will have learned all of the rules for capitalization. They are applying those. The same will then happen after English 2 for punctuation. So English 2, you may have noticed sub-indicator B, I think, talks about the use of dashes. Yes, and that is the last of the punctuation skills that they will learn. So when you go to English 3, it just says to use or apply the knowledge of punctuation. So they're going to learn those skills up through English 2 for different types of punctuation, semicolons, dashes, hyphens, and then they're going to apply moving forward. Any other takeaways? Anything for, yep, and Sophia, we will talk about that. Because yes, you're going to see some things that may not necessarily be what your students are coming to you having already mastered, right? So what do you do? So we'll look at that in just a second to see where those skills are actually learned in the previous grade levels. Any other takeaways, considerations? Does this give you ideas for things that you feel like you might need to revisit, or next steps for your instruction? Are there resources that you might need to pull from to provide that additional support or instruction around concepts? So these are just kind of, questions to ponder. So we've looked at now kind of indicator by indicator, right? We've looked at just your one specific grade level in those sub indicators and gotten really, really specific into the nitty gritty of that piece of the puzzle just for English 1 or 2 or what have you. But another way that we can look at this standard across all grade levels is through, go forward, a resource that we call our Grammar and Conventions Matrix. So this is on our instructional resources page, and we have it in the chat. We also have it on your landing page. But what this does is it takes that standard C4 and it's going to show you each of the grammar skills within our standards and where they are introduced at each grade level. So where you see that I, that little box with an I, that's where that skill is first introduced. So again, it's just a matrix format. It's not different information. It's just a different way of looking at the information for C4.1. And again, it shows where skills are introduced. It doesn't necessarily mean it's where the learning stops, right? And that just means that's the first time that students are going to see it. This allows for intentional instruction. So we know kind of what our piece of the puzzle is, but also for support. Like Sophia, you mentioned that students may come in lacking some skills that we know were introduced in previous grade levels. So this helps us to maybe identify where there might have been a gap in the learning and how we might build some support in to get them to where they need to go. So I want you to just open this for a moment and take a look at it. And think about any noticings. Is there anything that you notice in terms of skills or patterns that are of particular interest to you? And you can drop it in the chat if you want, or you can just think to yourself. But just take a look at it so you can see kind of all of those skills across the board for every grade level. And I apologize, y'all. I keep coughing. I'm struggling with the temperature change. I don't know if anyone else gets a little kind of like that when it starts to turn cold. Wish it was blue from the eye all the way to show where that instruction continues. That's a great piece of feedback. Yep, nothing new introduced English 4, only a few things English 3. Yeah, mostly at that point we are applying previously learned skills. We want students to really master those concepts. Absolutely. As you look at that, you may notice that there's a large number of skills or content that are introduced in earlier grade levels, like elementary and middle really are the ones who have the bulk of that content. And there's so much, right? All of the different ways that we capitalize, all of the different ways that we might use, yes, certain types of punctuation. There is tons in elementary. And you may notice that there are some skills that you are still commonly having to teach or reteach to students in your classes, right? I know that when I had English 1 students, I was still going over parts of speech, right? Because they were still coming in having some gaps in their learning. And so it's important for us as educators to just make sure we have an understanding of our specific expectations for our grade level, but also to see what learning has taken place before students come to our class. So we want to be aware of our end of grade level expectation, but also where we might need to support. And there's a saying that we use in our team. We learned it in some professional development. It was called, "What do you touch and what do you hold?" Right? So what I want to hold are my grade level expectations. Those are the skills that I want to make sure students have access to. And that's the piece of the puzzle that I play. And then what do I need to touch might be some of those things that students need that support in from the prior grade levels, right? What I don't want to do is try to hold the things from elementary school and never get them to or expose them to the expectations for my grade level. Because then when they go to the next grade level, they're going to say that English 2 teacher didn't talk about blah, blah, blah. You know, where was that? Where, you know, there was a gap. So we want to make sure that we touch and behold what we need to. So that is where we want to talk a little bit about explicit instruction and writing experience. So those gaps or shifts in content expectation can sometimes cause teachers to question how to provide support for students when it comes to ensuring mastery of those complex concepts, right? Especially when we know that the end goal is for students to apply these skills in their writing. They still may need that explicit instruction, right? And this was something we had a conversation about in our summer session when we talked about grammar as well. Yes, we want students to apply in the writing, but they also need the explicit instruction to gain those skills. So knowing that the end goal is for students to apply in their writing doesn't negate the fact that students may still need the explicit instruction on those specific grammar and conventions concepts, right? What it means is that teachers need to be intentional in their instructional choices and provide that balance, right? Just like we're doing in this session here. We're talking a little bit, we're looking at some things, but then we need to debrief, we need to apply it. So in just a little bit, we're going to have an opportunity to explore our instructional resources and practices for grammar and convention. But before we do, I want us to maybe talk about what might constitute the explicit instruction, when might we want to do the explicit instruction, what might constitute the writing experience, when do we want students to have that writing experience. So I've got a little table here of explicit instruction, writing experience. Who the facilitator is, maybe a little description, what the purpose of each of those is, and then when we might use them. And so I'm just going to kind of pause here. I'm not going to read them to you. I'm just going to give you a moment to glance at this and think about it. And then I'll ask you a question afterwards. So starting with explicit instruction, just take a moment to look at what we have here. And now the writing experience. As we think about these and the balance of the two, I want to tap into you as resources and the experts in the field. when we think about explicit instruction and writing experience, what do those look like in your classroom or the classrooms of those that you support? How are you or the teachers that you serve providing explicit instruction? What do the writing experiences look like? Are students applying their knowledge of grammar and conventions in their writing? And is there a balance? So take just a moment, share your experiences. I would love to see in the chat what that looks like for you or the teachers that you serve. Okay, I see teachers sharing exemplars, rubrics, providing feedback, student conferencing, peer group revisions, a gradual release model, templates for writing structures, rubrics for expectations. Absolutely. And I'm seeing a couple people still adding their responses. Explicit instruction in your classroom looks like writing beside students, modeling how you think about choices. Yes, use patterns of power model. Fantastic. And we call that kind of like a peek behind the curtain, right? We want students to see some of the messy work of writing. Keeping in mind that when they read, right, when we are doing novel studies, for example, or we're pulling resources from our instructional materials, all they're seeing is the polished end product. So when we want students to write, they don't know necessarily what the messy side of writing looks like unless they have that peek behind the curtain, right, from the perspective of the author. And you writing beside them is that peek behind the curtain, right? Because if you only ever see the polished product, how are you going to feel comfortable going through the messy process of writing to create something more polished? Right. I see scaffolding. I see multiple exposures. Fantastic. Yes. Yes, absolutely. Use of anchor text for teacher to model, scholars to analyze, write for different purposes. And that's actually a great segue into the next slide because when we talk about writing experiences, we also talk about within that, there being opportunities for both what we might call generative and evaluative experiences, right? So students can apply their learning through those generative experiences, which are, the creation of their own work, as well as evaluative experiences where they are evaluating their own past work or the work of others. And the evaluative experiences actually may be especially helpful for demonstrating mastery with the standards that we're discussing today with improving writing, right? Where we're looking at grammar and conventions, and we're looking at those other aspects of improving writing, like feedback, revision, or planning. But keep in mind also, I know I just said evaluative, can be especially helpful for these standards. An intentionally crafted rubric for a generative experience can also help students to demonstrate their learning in these specific skills. So it all comes down to, how are we crafting that so that students explicitly can demonstrate that mastery. All right, so that was a lot. We just went through those grade level indicators for C4 and C5. We talked a little bit about the grammar and conventions matrix. We've talked about explicit instruction. We've talked about writing experiences, evaluative and generative experiences. So we're going to close out this section with what we call a reflect, connect, project. So out of these, I want you to pick just one of the 3 prompts to reflect on in the chat. The first being, if you choose reflect, then reflect on what misconceptions have been clarified or new learning experienced from this discussion that we just had. Connect. How does this section align to what you already do? Is it affirming the work that you do? Or project, with what next steps can you take to apply what you've learned so far? So take a moment for your reflect, connect, project. And as you do that, I am modeling some strategies here that you might find useful to share with your teachers or to use in your own classrooms. You're welcome to do that. At the end of our session, when I share back our resources and the recording later on this week, I will give you a participant copy of the slides. So you can use any of these slides to share with your teachers if you want. So take a moment to reflect, connect, project, whichever one you want, add to the chat. And then we'll close out this section and talk about our instructional practices. Right. So I'm seeing Grammar and Conventions Matrix. You visited it before, which we're so glad that you have seen it before, maybe revisiting it with your vertical team. Absolutely. Focus on modeling writing, revision, providing feedback. Want to dive into the vertical articulation of the standards. Yep, get a better idea of what the key differences are between the grade levels that you teach. Yes. And in some cases, depending on the indicators that you're looking at, those may be subtle differences or they may be major differences. Right. Kim, perfectly timed for round 2 of TDW scoring analysis. Teachers seem reluctant to allow for multiple revisions, help to magnify the standard for revision, clarify it from editing. Yes, that was one of the major shifts from 2015 to 2024 was to make sure we really clarified the difference between revision and editing, that we weren't conflating them. We found sometimes in the field they were conflated. And I'm so glad that you mentioned TDW because I forgot to tell y'all when you went to your breakout rooms, I added onto your landing page the link at the very bottom. So I gave you the assessment quick links for teachers, which gives you everything regarding assessment, but I put the link just to the English 2 writing component page that has the rubrics. It has the specifications for the English 2 assessment. And there is also a link on there to a webinar that our development partners recorded earlier this year on the transition from TDA to TDW. So they go through what the differences are, what that might mean for your instruction. So if that is helpful to you, it is right there at the bottom of your page. Feel free to use that and the contact info for your English 2 EOC development person. That's Rebecca Runlet. Her contact info is on that page as well. And yes, Brenna, we do have a webinar on subtle differences. I see next steps, be intentional about filling in the gaps by revisiting certain topics. Yes, the touch or holds helpful in all subject areas because we don't want to spend too much time on what the students should have learned in the past. We want to make sure we visit it if we know that it's a need, right? But we also want to make sure that at the end we are focusing on what our piece of the puzzle is as well. For sure. Focus on the end skills for each grade. Reteaching elementary skills doesn't push the scholars forward. Yes. And one thing that is in that assessment specification document is that for English 2, students are not asked to identify parts of speech, right? That's not going to be something that they're asked to do. It's about the application of their knowledge and skills. Yes. Next steps, revisiting some topics when it comes to grammar, using the matrix to guide it. Yes, yes. So fantastic. I'm so glad that you have some takeaways, you have some reflections, or that this affirmed things that you are already doing. That's wonderful. Okay. we are going to move into some instructional practices and collaboration. And for this, we're going to talk a little bit about the alignment of our instruction, right? So we want our instruction to align to the intent of the grade level indicators. We have taken a good chunk of time to look at the intent of those grade level indicators. We use that then to plan our instruction intentionally. And then we use that instruction to determine how we will formatively assess our students' learning. And this is an iterative process. So we may use that formative assessment or feedback to then go back into the indicators to see where we need to revisit. Or maybe there are instructional strategies that we need to adapt to better support our learners, right? So I know it looks linear on this page, but it really is iterative, right? But starting with those grade level indicators and building from there. So for today, when we look at instruction, I want us to focus on what I'm calling these like 4 main aspects or kind of pots of information within that improving writing standard, C5. So planning, editing, feedback, and revising. Those are the components of improving writing within that standard. And we do each of those 4 things through the lens of student writing in the 3 modes, right? Through argumentative writing, informative writing, narrative writing. And remember that editing piece includes the expectations for grammar that we just addressed with 4.1, right? When we ask students to edit, we want them to edit for the skills that we have provided instruction on through those grammar standards or through that grammar indicator. So that's going to be our focus today, are these 4 main aspects. Again, revisiting our definitions for revision and editing. I want us to talk just really quickly, now that we've had this discussion on those 2 and the difference between the 2 and those grade level expectations, which one do you think comes first?
What I'm going to say is,
which one do you think comes first, revision or editing? In your experience? All right, I'm seeing revision. Okay. Oh, okay. So it seems like everyone kind of has the same thoughts on that. What happens if they're flipped? What happens if editing comes before revision? All right, should be revision, but maybe students tend to edit first. Editing tends to be the quickest fix, right? We know where we need to capitalize. We know where we need to add the punctuation. Yeah, they think they're done. Yeah. Yeah. Have any of you, as a student, ever experienced a teacher giving you a piece of writing back and it was just covered in the red pen? They've just outlined the errors. They didn't address the content. I know I remember getting some papers back with the red pen. How does that make you feel as a writer? Do you think it made your writing better? Red pen does give English teachers. I still don't use a red pen for that exact reason. I've got a Flair pen in every color. I did not use the red. Yeah. Yeah, just because we change the punctuation and write it in neater handwriting, it doesn't necessarily mean that the writing is better. It just means it's prettier. Yes. And there is a space for each of those things, right? But I think as someone said earlier, you know, editing really is that polishing, that final thing. But if we haven't changed the content in a way that is meaningful for our task, purpose, and audience, then that final proofreading and polishing at the end doesn't help the writer to necessarily meet all of their goals. Right? So I want us to think a little bit about that as well when we look at some of these instructional practices. And coming back to a quote that again really draws my attention from John Warner from the Writer's Practice. We have this book quoted in our standards document. It says, "One of the great regrets of my life as a writing teacher is how much time I spent giving students feedback about all the things they were doing wrong in their writing. I did this because it was done to me as a student, And it took a number of years for me to realize that for the most part, those corrections and criticisms weren't particularly helpful when it came to learning how to write. I just want us to think about that a little bit when it comes to kind of where each of these things fits within our puzzle of instruction. Again, we're going to focus on planning, editing, feedback, and revision. And we're going to do that through a little bit of an I have, I need. So think to yourself, out of those 4 pots, so revision, feedback, editing, and planning, which one would you say is your I have, so your greatest strength in writing instruction? And which one is your I need, so your area that you would like to further explore? So just think, what's your I have? What's your I need? I would say my I have personally, feedback in my classroom was my area of greatest strength. That was a natural part of my class. We had lots of ways that students provided feedback to one another, or that, I provided feedback or students gave me feedback. That was just a culture in my classroom. But the I need, which I think I said earlier, probably would have been editing, because I always fell back on the editing checklist, right? And I was always looking for more interactive ways for students to edit that weren't just, you know, did you capitalize all of your proper nouns? Do you have a punctuation at the end of all of your sentences? Yep, so the 4 choices, so these are within that language of the indicator: planning, feedback, editing, and revision. Thank you, Brenna. Brenna's got it in the chat for you. And I want you to think about that because in just a moment, we're going to look at those 4 pots, and you're going to have an opportunity to look at what we call micro, mini, and macro writing experiences. And what this means essentially is that students have a variety of writing experiences, different lengths, different purposes, right? Not everything is the end of unit essay. We want students to write throughout. So we have some examples for you of micro experiences, which are things that take less than 1 class period. Mini experiences, which are writing experiences that are 1 to 2 class periods. And then macro experiences, which are your culminating experiences. So you will have a chance to look at some of those, and you'll have a chance to look at a couple of resources that we have put together for each of those 4 areas. So for planning, editing, feedback, and revision. So I want you to think about your I have and your I need, and I want you to use that to guide what you look at next. So what we're going to do is I'm going to give you, let's say, about 5 minutes, okay, about 5 minutes. And depending on what you choose here, you're going to go look at some of the different resources that we're going to drop in the chat for you. Okay, so if you want to explore your I have, maybe you've got a strength that you feel good about, then when Brenna drops the link in the chat, you'll see that there are 4 folders. There's a folder for each of those 4 areas, and there's a document that's called Micro Mini Macro Examples, or Micro Mini Macro Master Document, that has all of those writing experiences on it. So if you want to explore your area of greatest strength, then maybe you go look at one of the micros, minis, or macro experiences and think about how it could be revised to incorporate your strength. So if feedback was your area of greatest strength, I might look at some of those writing experiences and think about how I might build feedback into it. Maybe I've already got some ideas. If you want to explore your I need, then maybe you go into one of the folders for that area. And in there, you're going to see some resources. You'll see some strategies. You might see some articles. You might see a graphic organizer. So take a look at one of those resources. Think about how you could use that in your planning and instruction. So if editing was my area of greatest need, then I might go into the editing folder and I might pull one of those strategies and maybe think about how I might try that in a unit that I have coming up. Okay, so we're going to take about 5 minutes for you to explore your resources. Okay, maybe depending on your I have or your I need. And then we'll come back and do a little bit of reflection. Okay, so at 11:48, I'll ask you to come back and do some reflecting. All right, go ahead and access that folder that's in the chat and get started. as we sort of come to a close of just independently exploring those examples and resources based on your I haves or your I needs, I just want to do a little bit of a check here. Are you seeing any ideas, resources, strategies that you feel could be used or that you could adapt to support your work or the work of those that you support? Would love to hear if there's anything that you found that was particularly interesting, helpful, or even affirming. Maybe you see something that aligns to what you're already doing. Micros, minis, macros. Yes, I'm so glad that those will be helpful to you. And the webinars that I have posted at the bottom of your landing page, we talk about micros, minis, macros in each of those. So we talk about micros, minis, macros for argumentative writing, micros, minis, macros for informative, expository, and micros, minis, macros for narrative. With the idea, again, that we're just giving students lots of opportunities to write throughout instruction. So I'm seeing some of the graphic organizers, Radar, Stay. Absolutely. Oh, the Cube brainstorm. Yes. Mandy and I were just talking about the Cube brainstorm yesterday. She's like, I've never heard of that. As an interesting way to plan your writing and thinking about a topic from a variety of lenses. We also talked about the circle, square, triangle. So glad that you liked that. One thing that I didn't include on there, but could be an interesting activity for planning, if we want students to be intentional about the choices that they make to address their audience, they could always do some sort of audience profile or audience analysis before they begin writing, where they go in depth and explore who their audience is, what message it is that they need to hear, how they might need to hear that, and then use that to determine what their next steps will be for their writing. Right. That's one that I could add if you want. I could build that out and put it in the planning folder. But I just thought about it yesterday. I was like, Mandy, I should have come up with that and put it in there. But if you think that might be helpful for your students, then I could certainly add that as an additional strategy. Seeing lots of you mention the micros, minis, macros, the resources in general. So I'm so glad that that you feel that those could be helpful for your students or for teachers if you are in a supporting role for teachers. You have that folder and all of those resources on your landing page. So bookmark it, save it, share whatever you find to be helpful. Those are there for you always. What we would have done next is maybe pop out into another breakout room and then share takeaways. But since we're a small group, I figured we could just kind of share them together. So this is here. If this is an activity that you want to replicate with your audience, they can review, they can reason, and they can reflect. And that will be in the slides, which I will share with you on your page when I send the resources back out. So I'll have a participant copy of the slides that you can use. All right, we are going to wrap up with a little bit of clarity and closure since we have a little less than 10 minutes of time together. Starting with what I call a 4C reflection. So thinking about everything that we've learned so far today, the conversation that we've had. We have 4 C's here, and out of those, I just want you to select one to reflect on. So in the top left corner, we have conversation. So who will you have a conversation with about today's learning? Is there a teacher down the hall that couldn't make it, but maybe you want to share with them? Or maybe you're the department chair and you want to talk to your whole department? Connection, make a connection between your work and today's learning. Commitment, what is one thing you will commit to trying based on today's learning? And then lastly, change. What could change as a result of what you have learned today? So pick whichever of the 4 C's you want and drop your reflection in the chat. Patty, I see you say you're the instructional coach at your school. Share all the ideas and learnings today. Share information with admin, leadership team, and department. Fantastic. So glad that you found this helpful. Oh, Renee, you've got a big English department. Oh my goodness. Conversation with a team member. So I'm so glad that you find the resources helpful in the conversation that we've had today. And that you feel that there are specifically some people that you can share these ideas with. Again, your landing page will have all of the resources that we discussed. Brenna's going to put it in the chat one more time. And like I said, these slides, I will put a participant copy on the landing page if you want to share any of this with your audience or even take some of those activities. Denise, special education teacher, share this with the general education teachers. Yes, that is wonderful. Absolutely. Thank you. Let's see. Yeah, it's always good to have fresh ideas, fresh perspective. And yes, we are all learners. Brenna and Mandy and I are constantly reading, constantly watching videos, attending webinars, trying to learn to figure out how we can best support our teachers across the state. So yes, we are all always learning. All right. Wrapping up, I want us to revisit our pulse check. So we did our pre-assessment at the beginning, or what we called our pulse check, to see where we were at the beginning, with the goal being that maybe we move up just a little bit further on that scale. So again, you can put this in the chat if you want, or you can just reflect personally, starting with, I don't know why my things are all backwards. I'm just going to click all of them. How about that? Starting with the standards expectations for improving writing. Do you feel you thoroughly understand the expectations for C4 and C5? Instructional strategies. Do you feel that you have a variety of strategies that you can pull from when asking students to demonstrate their learning around revision, editing, and grammar? And then writing experiences. Can you identify opportunities for students to write for varying lengths and depths? And can you adapt writing experiences to intentionally incorporate skills for improving writing? The only thing that I will check for here is, can you tell me, do you feel like you have moved up somewhere on the scale in any of these areas? And you can give me a thumbs up or just a yes. Do you feel like we've made some progress today? All right, I see a yes. That's a success. Fantastic. Okay, wonderful, wonderful. Right, any step forward is a success. Fantastic, fantastic. And you can actually replicate the same pulse check with your students or with your teachers if you want, and just switch out what the criteria is. It's just a fun little kind of pre and post assessment, sort of informal check-in. All right, so our very last step is going to be feedback. So remember, our feedback form is just that last little piece that we need to make sure that you were here for the entirety of the session. And Brenna is going to drop that in the chat for you. If you would take a moment to fill that out, I will use that information to share back your renewal certificate for today's credit hours. Again, on the form, it will ask for the title and it will ask for my name. So the title of today's session was Improving Writing for English 1 through 4. My name is Casey Prince Harvey. My email address is right there on the screen if you ever want to reach out with any questions or if there's anything that I can do to support your work. And I also have included here on the right-hand side our fall webinars. So this is our third fall webinar. We will have 3 more this month through December. So we will have an improving writing session for elementary. So if you know any elementary teachers or coaches or specialists who want to learn and work through this same content, but for the elementary level, we will have that. We'll also have in November improving writing for middle school. And then I will be back with you in December. We will talk about oral communications for English 1 through 4. So we've talked about our standards that address writing, but there are also oral communications. Those are our last 3 standards in the written and oral communication strand. So we'll talk about those 3 as well. So again, take just a moment to complete the feedback. Additionally, we have office hours this fall. That will be a time where you can register, pop in. If you have questions, we will begin each session with an overview or a deep dive or support for specific standards for each of those grade bands, and then we'll have an opportunity to answer any questions that you may have. So those are the dates there. We also have the office hours registration that we can drop in the chat for you for October. So our next office hours session will be next Thursday. So you are welcome to still register if you want to attend. Other than that, once you've completed your feedback form, you are good to go. We will linger and listen if you have any additional questions. But other than that, we so appreciate you taking the time to come and hang out with us for a little bit today and talk about improving writing and collaborate with one another. And it's so great to see so much representation from across the state. Feel free to reach out if you ever have any questions. And like I said, we will linger and listen for just a little bit, and I'll go ahead and stop the recording. So thank y'all so much. Hope you have a great rest of your day.